It is sometime between 155 and 160 AD, and we are in the city of Smyrna, which is in the modern-day city of Izmir, Turkey. And here we have Polycarp. And Polycarp was an important bishop in his day. At this point, he is in his late 80s, around the age of 86. And Polycarp, according to legend, had been discipled by the Apostle John himself, and had lived for years as both a priest and then later as a bishop in the modern-day state of Turkey. Polycarp had been a fighter for orthodoxy. He had at one point confronted the heretic Marcion in the city of Rome and called him the firstborn of Satan. And he had also waged war, intellectually speaking, against a number of the Gnostics in and around the regions of his city. And tradition has it that he converted quite a number of them, correcting them of the theological errors that they believed to be associated with the Christian faith. At this point, though, Polycarp is ready to be executed. The Roman officials of the area had had enough of Polycarp, and they had decided that Christianity was just simply too strange, and that it was making too many inroads into the Roman world, and so Polycarp was ready to be executed. And Polycarp had an enormous amount of calm during the process. His friends had pleaded with him to leave, to flee, knowing that the Roman governors probably would not chase after him or go looking far and wide to see if they could find this 86-year-old man. But Polycarp remained in his home. And so, when the soldiers discovered where he lived and they came and knocked, Polycarp opened the door and he said just simply, "God's will be done." And he invited the soldiers in, and at least according to the story that was written down after the fact, he even gave them refreshments as they awaited to take him off to be put on trial publicly. And so Polycarp is led to a local arena, and there he is publicly questioned. And he banters back and forth with the person that is inquiring about his faith. At one point, he is accused of being an atheist, a strange thing for a Christian to be accused of, but in the Roman world, when you do not believe in the pantheon of the gods, to only believe in this Lord Christ, to them, sounded like atheism. And Polycarp sort of coyly points to the crowd and says, "No, these are the atheists." And after a time, Polycarp eventually realizes that the back and forth between he and his accuser was simply not going to solve anything. And so eventually he says, "Why do you delay? Come, do what you will." And so the soldiers seize Polycarp, and they are going to nail him hands and feet to the stake before they begin to burn it. But Polycarp pleads that they not do this and asks instead that they just allow him to stand. And he says that the Lord will give him strength to endure the fire. And in the end, he is burned to death. This story of Polycarp would later be written down and actually serve as one of the earliest documents that we have of the earliest Christian persecutions by the Romans. And so in this lecture, we're going to look at the persecution of the Christian church in the earliest centuries of the church, up until the 3rd century crisis. In a later lecture, we'll look at the 3rd century crisis and take a look at some of the harsher persecutions that occurred there. But in this lecture, we're going to look at the earliest centuries of the church. How did they engage with the Roman world, and then how did the Roman world respond with persecution? And the first thing we have to say is that persecution of Christians is often misunderstood. There are popular misconceptions about how Christians were persecuted and about the ways in which the Roman world and the Roman government treated Christians as a whole. Often, particularly in textbooks or in popular books on the subject, the first centuries of the church are treated as if the Christians were subject to ethnic cleansing, or to something as heinous as the Nazi treatment of the Jews in World War II. In fact, with some diffidence, we want to stress that that is not the case. Now, there is some pretty heinous persecution, and we're going to talk about those moments. But we have to understand that in general, overall, given the breadth and the depth of the Roman government and the amount of land that it covers, and looking at the church as a whole for several centuries, by and large, as we'll see, persecutions were sporadic and they were local. In fact, at times, only a handful would be persecuted, not thousands and thousands of Christians. We don't see Rome attempting to wipe Christians from the face of the earth, at least not in these centuries. When we get to the 3rd century crisis and up into Diocletian in the early 4th century, we do see something close to that. It gets significantly worse by that period of time. But from the earliest days, from the time of the apostles up until the early 200s, Christianity is sporadically persecuted, and it is by and large ignored, though it is on the books oppressed and illegal. And the division between these two periods of persecution really kind of falls almost fully into the division that we talk about between the early characterization of the Roman Empire and its later manifestation before its fall in the 5th century. Historians divide the type of government that is in place in Rome between two major categories. First of all, we have the Principate. And the Principate begins from about 31 BC, that's the time of Julius Caesar, down until about 284. During this time, the Principate is called that because, despite the fact that the Roman emperor was very much in charge, and despite the fact that he was an emperor, he was the autocrat, nevertheless, from Augustus Octavius on, the emperor was the princeps. That is to say, he was first among equals. He was not a full autocrat in the sense that we sometimes believe it. The emperor was expected to mingle amongst the senatorial classes as an equal. He was not expected to treat them as somehow beneath him. Very often, the emperor had to abide by certain stipulations that the Senate would impose, or he would have to get their approval or their backing or their support by and large. And so this is the Principate. And during times of the Principate, in general, the emperor, while again very much in charge, is still beholden to the Senate. And very often, the emperor is more focused on that than anything else. He's more focused on global politics, on what is going on throughout the empire, or he's very much involved with local politics in the city of Rome itself. So very often during the Principate, the emperor and the Senate as a whole are not casting much of an eye on Christians in the East and in Asia Minor. Christianity is very much a minority religion. And, as we'll see in just a minute, Christians do not rebel. They don't turn to violence when they are persecuted or when they feel marginalized in society. And so really, the Christians gave no reason for the Romans to come after them. And by and large then, during the Principate, they did not look to the Christians as much of an opposition. They didn't see them as seditious. They knew that Christians did not like to take up arms. And therefore, during the Principate, you do not have a lot of widespread persecution. Now that changes with the coming of the Dominate. And the Dominate lasts from roughly 284 to 476. And what is striking about the Dominate is it begins as a pagan entity, and then with the coming of Constantine in the early 300s, the Dominate becomes Christian as well. And the Dominate is called that because it is at this time, from 284 on, that increasingly the emperor does not have to abide by or engage with the senatorial classes, and, more importantly, the emperor began to be referred to as the Dominus, as Lord. He was now fully in command. He took on an almost ancient Near Eastern or a Persian style of aura or of authority amongst his peoples. The senatorial classes no longer would be his equals. He would not mingle with them. He would engage in all kinds of ceremonies to stoke up his own sense of authority. And therefore, it is during the Dominate, during those periods of times before Constantine comes to the throne, that we see the worst persecutions. That is because during the Dominate, the emperors in most cases come from the army. And the army is a bastion of traditional paganism, and therefore, these rock-ribbed, stiff-spined military soldiers who come to the throne do not look lightly on any denial of the role of the gods in traditional paganism. And therefore it is under the Dominate that we see the worst and the most systemic and widespread persecutions. Now, before we get into the history of it, a little comment on the sources. One of the things that historians are somewhat troubled by is the fact that we don't have a lot of first-hand accounts of martyrdom in the first several centuries. By far, the most important text that we use to determine the stories of martyrdom during these centuries comes from Eusebius. And Eusebius is not living during the times of persecution first and foremost. Now, he was living during the Diocletian era, which was a period of persecution. But when Eusebius sits down to write his history of the church, he is describing the first several centuries of the church from the vantage point of Constantine's rise to the throne. In other words, what Eusebius is describing in his book is the ways in which Christians suffered before the rise of Constantine to the throne. Now, according to Eusebius, Constantine coming to the throne was essentially a miracle. It was impossible to believe that suddenly they had a Christian emperor. And so therefore, when he's telling the history of the Christian church, he's not doing so in a vacuum. He's not doing so also during the persecutions themselves. Rather, he's trying to codify and describe in whatever detail he can, with whatever sources he can, the ways in which Christians suffered from the beginning of the apostolic age all the way down until the beginning of the 4th century with Constantine. And some historians have been cynical about this, and they've said, well, Eusebius is just playing up the evidence. And we don't have to go there. This is the only source we have, and this is written by somebody who's living in an age of triumph. Nevertheless, Eusebius, historians will say in general, is attempting to write the history as it happened, at least according to the sources. And so therefore we can look at Eusebius as a trustworthy source, though we have to be careful with it in general. Now, if we want to talk about Christianity in the Roman world in the first several centuries, we have to look at Christianity in relationship to Judaism, because Romans generally see Christians as at least somewhat connected to the Jewish faith, which of course is only natural because the Christian faith is connected to the Jewish faith. However, there is again a misconception here. There are a lot of people who believe that the Romans had trouble distinguishing between Jews and Christians in the early centuries of the church. In fact, the Romans were quite good at telling the difference between these two, at least in general, if only by the fact that the Jews quite often would point out certain Christians in their midst and would say, these are not us. But the relationship between Judaism and Rome goes back until time before the birth of Christ. And we already looked at this a bit in our lecture on the Greek world, where we talked about the Maccabean revolt. In general, the Alexandrian period and the subsequent years of the Seleucid dynasties, as well as the other dynasties, gave rise to what we call the Jewish diaspora. And the Jewish diaspora is a period of time in which Judaism spreads. It moves and it spreads throughout most of the urban populations of the known world. And one of the things that's often overlooked is just how many Jews there were in the Roman and the Greek worlds. By one count, by the time of the birth of Christ, the Jewish population numbered about 8 to 10% of the Roman population. That is a pretty staggering amount if you just consider the sheer numbers of people involved. To consider that 8 to 10% in general are Jewish, you're talking about a really substantial presence. Not only that, but the Jews were incredibly intellectual. Take the city of Alexandria, for example, the city that itself was founded by Alexander. And Alexander at this time had roughly 1 million people, maybe a bit less. But Alexandria had as much as a third of its population as Jewish. And they were incredibly intellectual. It was in Alexandria, predominantly, where the study of the Septuagint arose, where real deep study of the Scriptures took place. And above all, it was in Alexandria where Philo, one of the most important Jewish intellectuals in history, lived and wrote. Now, despite the fact that the Jewish population was widespread, it had a bit of a tense relationship with Rome. On the one hand, Rome actually had a great deal of respect for Judaism, at least according to their own categories. They kept Judaism at arm's length in some ways, but they could not underestimate the fact that the Jewish faith was really ancient. And for the Romans, to be ancient was to be better, was to be good. They did not understand monotheism. They thought it was a bit crazy. And they also didn't understand the sacrificial system and some of the regulations that the Jews went through. But nonetheless, they had some respect for the Jews. Still, despite that respect, Rome not only had trouble dealing with the local population in Israel and particularly in Jerusalem, but at times it bungled the situation entirely. Jerusalem itself was a real mess in some ways. And at one point, Pompey himself has to take over the city and restore order. And what happens is Pompey is the one who puts the half-Jewish Herod on the throne of Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, they tried a mixture of autonomy and Roman control that just simply was not bound to work. Of course, the Gospels give us this picture. You have the Sanhedrin law court, which runs Jerusalem and is in charge of any number of things. But yet there was always a proconsul over the city in the time of Christ, that is Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate is actually a bit of a bozo. He has somehow landed one of the worst jobs in the Roman army, and even by the gospel accounts, he simply does not know what he's doing. He, on the one hand, tries to make the Jews happy, and yet on the other hand, openly says that he doesn't really know what to do with this Jesus, and he's kind of pushed and prodded into doing what the Jews want him to do, which is to execute Jesus. But that is only the tip of the iceberg of the problem. You see, the problem is that the Romans are consistently under the assumption that the Jews are moving their way, that the Jews are becoming more syncretistic, that they're becoming more philosophical, that their seemingly backward ways of serving one God and following the rituals that had been there from the Old Testament were beginning to wane. And repeatedly, when the Jews will not come their way, the Romans resort to, as Antiochus IV did centuries before, they will resort to attempting to force the Jews to come their way. And so, for example, there are a number of attempts by Roman leaders, either locally or at the wider level, that attempt to push Jerusalem in this way. Caligula, for example, the emperor, attempted to put a statue of himself in the Holy of Holies. Not the best idea. And then at another time, the procurator Gessius Florus actually raided the temple treasury for himself and took the money. And as a result, the entirety of Jerusalem goes into an uproar. And what he does is he simply flees. He leaves the city. Why put this down? Just kind of let it peter itself out. And in fact, by doing so, he allows the fires to be stoked even further. And so from 66 to 73 AD, we have the First Jewish War. And this highlights something that needs to be pointed out right now. And that is that repeatedly in this period of time, and back to the period of the Maccabees, and even further back into the Old Testament, there is nothing in the Jewish religion that is pacifistic, at least not in general. When pushed far enough, the Jewish peoples will take up arms to defend itself and to try to kick out the armies by a show of violence. And what's interesting is the Romans actually respect the Jews for that. There are examples of the Romans actually speaking well of the Jews for their attempt to fight for what they believe, for their attempt to fight for their deities. And even though the Romans will put them down and put them down with authority, nevertheless, because the Jews attempt to fight for what they believe in, that is the Roman lingua franca. That is what the Romans believe ought to be done in this case. That, in and of itself, is one of the major differences between the Judaism of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD and that of Christianity in its early centuries. When the Romans find Christians, they know two things. One, they refer to Christians as new, which, again, belies the fact that Romans somehow couldn't distinguish between Jews and Christians. Romans always refer to Christians as that new group, that new sect, that superstitio, that superstitious cult. They never refer to Jews that way. And so when they see Christians, they know the difference. The other thing that Romans find is that Christians are pacifists. They do not take up arms. They are not rebellious. There were not attempts by the Christians to rise up and to overthrow the Roman establishment. And believe it or not, that struck Romans as the strangest thing they'd ever seen. For a Roman to be pacifist, to take the suffering upon oneself, as the early Christians did, was simply insane. If your God is strong, they believed, if you served a deity who was actually more powerful than the Roman deities, then it ought to be proved, and your deity ought to step in and defend you, at least in some ways. But in particular, to be pacifist and to be a new faith, at least seemingly a new faith, is to be strange to the Romans. And so as we move from the 1st century into the 2nd century, the major element of persecution that will occur for the Christians is that as they are separated in the Roman mind from the Jews, what will happen is Romans will start to attack the Christians in a way that they have never attacked the Jews. They will single the Christians out in a unique way. And therefore, it is the Christians who suffer in a different way than the Jews did before them. The Jews were occasionally forced or attempted to be forced to syncretize, to become more Roman, to become pluralistic, and they always resisted that. The Christians, however, become illegal. They become scapegoated frequently. Whenever calamity befalls Rome, it is the Christians who are to blame. Rome never treated the Jews that way, but for the Christians in the 1st centuries, they will. Okay, now as we turn to look at the actual persecutions in the early church, we're going to see that in the early years, in the early decades of the church, the Christians were wrapped up with the Jewish context in general. Now, as we've already said, the Jews and the Christians were distinguishable by the Romans. But that doesn't mean that the Romans were unconcerned with the ways that Jews and Christians interacted. And one of the first things that we see is that in AD 49, the Emperor Claudius actually expels the Jews in Rome due to a controversy over someone named Chrestus. Now, the word Chrestus in this case comes from a secondary source. Suetonius tells us about this controversy. And the majority of historians have come to the conclusion that what is happening here is that Suetonius is simply misspelling the word for Christus, which is Christ. Now, there is some debate on this. There are historians who do not like this conclusion. But nonetheless, it does seem to be the case that what is happening is that the Jews in Rome are disputing about the nature of Christ, about who Christ is, was he the Messiah? And that dispute got to such a pitch that it forced the Emperor Claudius just simply to expel the Jews entirely from Rome. Now, this opinion is the majority view by historians because in another place, Suetonius uses the same spelling when he is explicitly referring to Christians. There's other evidence as well. In the book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 2, we find that Paul first comes into contact with Aquila and Priscilla, two of his right-hand people during his ministry. And this chapter tells us that Paul comes into contact with them because the Jews had been expelled from Rome. Now, it doesn't make much sense to say that here are some Christians who have been expelled from Rome because of this fight, and they have arrived to help Paul in his ministry in another location, and that therefore the debate in Rome was somehow irrelevant to Christianity. It seems almost certainly the case, given the evidence, that what has happened in Rome is there was a debate, that there were fights, that it probably turned violent, which caused Claudius to kick both Jews and Christians out in AD 49. Within 15 years, though, the situation is more grave. When Nero comes to the throne, Nero in particular is violently oppressive of Christians. We know by at least tradition that the Apostle Paul was killed sometime around 66 or 67 AD in the city of Rome. It is also according to tradition that Peter was crucified. Some say upside down, that Peter asked to be crucified upside down. Some say in the city of Rome, but we don't have any evidence one way or the other. More importantly, though, is the fire of Rome in AD 64. In AD 64, the city of Rome went ablaze, and a significant portion of it burned down. Now, the reason for this is, of course, in certain parts of Rome, a lot of it is wood houses, but also you have to remember that in an ancient world, before you had wide streets capable of having multiple cars pass down the road, very often streets would be built very close together. And so from a fire hazard standpoint, if a fire erupts in one part of the city, it very quickly can spread throughout. Now, even the secondary sources, the pagan sources, tell us that Nero was to blame for the firing of Rome, or at least he was implicated. Now, Nero denied this, and what happened is that Nero is believed to have wanted to rebuild his palatial estates down near the Colosseum region of the city. And so therefore he had a section of it set fire to in order that he could then justify taking over this region. Now, there's one myth about this, and then there's an actual historical fact to it. The myth about this, or at least the literary tradition that comes from it, is that a lot of people say that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Now, Nero didn't have a fiddle. That is a significantly later invention. One story does say that he sang of the fall of Ilium, the story that is accounted during the Iliad of Homer. But whatever the case, the more important situation is that Nero, in order to deflect the blame that he had set fire to Rome, according to the secondary sources, actually turns the blame onto the Christians. And let me read you a quote from Tacitus, one of the secondary sources from this period. Tacitus tells us that consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. Now, you can see in this that Tacitus is no lover of Christianity. He actually refers to Christianity as a superstitio, as one of these religions that is ecstatic, that attempts to control the deities, in this case, Christ or God. He doesn't really seem to know much about the Christian faith. But he does say that they are a class hated for their abominations. He goes on to say, however, that when Nero puts the blame of the fire onto the Christians, that eventually the anger by which Nero attacks the Christians and the tortures that he comes up with were so excruciating that eventually, Tacitus tells us, this abomination, this superstitio, Christianity, becomes pitied by the populace. Now, he doesn't mean that people begin to convert. For a Roman, to pity something is not a good thing. It is not something that they are attracted to, but nonetheless, they are pitying these poor souls who are being destroyed by the anger of Nero, Tacitus tells us. And Nero invented all kinds of tortures. One of the ones that is well known is that during a party, in order to provide light for his guests, he had the Christians wrapped in some kind of oilcloth, and then he set them afire, so that their bodies, once they were dead, and this oilcloth would serve as a lamp for the party. And there were a number of others as well, and again, I won't go into them because they are quite gruesome. And that's Nero. Now, again, we have to stress, the Neronian persecutions were intense, but they were short-lived, and they were localized. They happened mostly in and around the city of Rome. They did not happen throughout the empire. The next stage of persecution in the early church that's pretty well known is the persecution under the Emperor Trajan. And what happens is one of the procurators of a region, in this case his name is Pliny the Younger. Pliny is out in a region out into the east, and he writes a letter back to Trajan, and he says that he is shocked at how many in his location have become Christian. And he says he is surprised because there are so many. And he asked Trajan, how should we handle this situation? Certainly we don't want people converting to Christianity. And what happens is Trajan decides to apply the policy that they had applied to all other superstitio faiths or cults throughout the empire. Trajan, in other words, points to the way that the Druids were handled in the Celtic regions of Gaul, or the way that the excesses in the worship of Bacchus and that cult had been treated. And Trajan says, Pliny, don't go and seek Christians out, but in fact, if two or more people in person come and accuse someone of being a Christian, then you are to put them on trial. And you are not just to put them on trial and ask them lots of questions about if they are Christians, but you are to set up a sacrifice to one of the gods. And if they offer a pinch of incense, and if they taste the sacrificial meats, the steaks that had been burned and cooked on the altar, then we can be assured that they're not Christians and they are to go free. However, Trajan says, if they refuse to do this, or if they openly acknowledge that they are Christians, then they are to be put to death. Now, many see in this a certain generosity on the part of Trajan. He's saying, don't seek them out. Don't do heinous torture. Don't listen to hearsay. If a note is slipped under your door saying, my neighbor is a Christian, why don't you kill him? You're not to believe that. You have to have someone, not just one person in fact, but two people come in person and make the accusation in public so that it is known. And you can't just take their word for it. You have to put the person on trial. Now, again, many see this as a kind of benevolence, a kind of holding off of the pogroms or of the mob rule of certain actions against Christians. I tend to see it the other way around, though. What's worse, the tyranny and the hot-blooded anger of one man, no matter how vicious, no matter how evil the Neronian persecutions were? Is it worse to kill a few in a gruesome way, or to apply a law that always says governors and regional procurators throughout the Roman Empire must kill Christians if these standards are met? That, to me, is more cold-blooded. That, to me, is more systemic. It can then be applied more uniformly on the Roman world. Now, thankfully, it was not applied uniformly, that these local governors didn't always follow the rules, or maybe in some cases they didn't know all the rules related to Christians. But for me, for an emperor to say, here's the rules on how to cold-bloodedly kill Christians, here are the legal ramifications, it's not enough to say don't chase them, but to say if they don't do these things. And by the way, here's a litmus test. They must figure out these sacrifices, and you must have them do these things, and therefore you know they're a Christian, and then you can kill them. Well, again, that's more cold-blooded. In the end, the persecutions of Christians really followed these two patterns. On the one hand, the Neronian persecutions, the real hot-blooded, passionate persecutions, would endure at certain periods of time. Sometimes a plague would come to Rome, or a certain calamitous event, and Rome would get concerned and worried, and suddenly in a region or in a city, or in some cases in a larger region, persecution of Christians would explode, and for a short period of time, a number of Christians would be executed. That's the one hand, the more hot-blooded kind. On the other hand, though, from the point of Trajan all the way down until the time of Constantine in the 4th century, Christianity is now officially on the books as an illegal religion. It's illicit. It is unable to meet. Public preaching will be immediately met by the death penalty. And it's going to be both suppressed and oppressed. That is to say, it's going to be restricted. And then if it pops its head up, if Christians are found, or if they do things, if they proselytize, these kinds of things, then they're going to be suppressed. They're going to be killed. In particular, the pastors and the leaders of the church will come under persecution and will be executed. And so for a period of about 200 years, from the time of the apostles until the 3rd century crisis, which we'll look at in a later lecture, persecutions were sporadic, but they were at times hot-blooded and very intense. These persecutions were, again, not ethnic cleansing. They were not systemic. One can hardly say that the Roman governors ever really cared all that much for Christians, except when they were forced to care, when Christianity was spreading, or if certain Christians were more overt in their faith, maybe with preaching or with proselytizing. By and large, the Romans wanted to ignore the Christians and scare enough of them so that if they ever attempted to open their mouth and express their faith, that they would be held back from doing so. And so in the end, the early centuries were a time of persecution for the Christians. But even in the cases where the persecution didn't lead to thousands upon thousands of deaths, nevertheless, the Christian faith was a persecuted, hated, illegal religion for centuries after the time of the apostles. In fact, according to the traditions of the death of the apostles, which again are only traditions, but still, of the 12 apostles that are recorded in the book of Acts, one, of course, having replaced Judas, all but one is said to have died a violent death at the hands of the Roman government. And like the apostles, not a few of the earliest Christians paid the ultimate price for following their Lord.